Going to talk about countering identity creep today. We have an hour. That's a lot of time. My background is maybe a little bit different than some of the speakers. I'm a big entrepreneur geek. Started at NSA, a lot of security, involved with a lot of different startups. At Carbon Black, I talked to 600 or 700 different enterprises, more about endpoint security. But I say all that because we can kind of go anywhere with this hour, right? It's hopefully you guys get something out of it. So I give a lot of different kinds of talks. We're moving more into an identity space with Obsidian, so that's why we're really starting to think about problems like identity creep. But I just hope you remember something. And this is not going to be as technical as like the Bloodhound talk. But hopefully you walk away and you think about something. So basically at the end, I'll throw a whole bunch of takeaways at you, and hopefully something sticks. But we'll have times for questions or whatever you guys want. So state of cyber, I feel kind of silly putting some of these slides in here, seeing what some of the talks have already said, being day 2. For example, the video this morning explained what I have 3 or 4 slides to explain, which is cloud is a mess, and people don't know that it's still their responsibility. But that's okay, we'll go fast. So there's a lot of headlines. We're all sort of sick of it. The challenge, and also the template thing was kind of weird, so I sort of have mixed templates here. But we all see the headlines, but there is this fear of breach fatigue where people stop caring or stop paying attention because it's like, yeah, it's just another breach. It's like, no, we got to fight to make sure it stays relevant in people's minds, and it's not getting any better. And again, very technical audience, probably one of the most technical audiences I've seen. So I don't necessarily have to say this to you, but it's getting worse. It's not getting better, which is kind of sobering with how many companies, how much money is being spent. And it's leaky, right? Like the cloud, there's just so many times where an S3 bucket's open or a Mongo database is accessible or just Office 365 or whatever getting hit. And so there's plenty of challenges. There's a huge skills gap. So in my travels, I've met companies that have 300 open security positions. 300. And the guy's like, oh, if I can just hire a few people, I'll be happy. But I can hire 300 if I can find them. Something that I don't think gets talked about enough, but I'm sure everyone will be like, oh yeah, of course, I see that all the time, is what I call deploy and decay. Now, in the security tech stack, you set up your tools, you set up your stack, and it actually gets worse over time rather than better. Your environment's changing, the adversaries are changing, behavior's changing. It actually gets worse, and you have to spend a lot of time trying to care and feed that system. Same with identity and accounts. And then huge data. There's so much data. Every copy of data is a liability, and it's so easy to click a couple buttons and copy terabytes, if not more, of data. And then finally, attacker successes. If people are having success, it's like any market. There's going to be more people diving in, right? So as I was flying around the world, I said, there's actually a huge amount of huge lack of cyber self-esteem. Like, you talk to these teams and they don't think they have a shot. They don't think they can make change. The CISO doesn't think his or her team has any abilities. So not trying to be super negative, but that's kind of reality. And how do you convey reality when reality is scary and not sound like you're just trying to create fear, just trying to be real. And what's a talk without like a threatscape slide? Everyone in this room, I think, knows all this stuff. You get the financially motivated, most of the time, cyber criminals. You got hacktivists trying to make a point. You got nation states who are now starting to blend into, sometimes financially motivated, but usually it's more espionage or, cyber warfare kind of stuff, and insiders. But the reason I put this slide up is the 3 on the left all become insiders. And at a conference like this, of course, supremely relevant because it's all about credentials. How can I get credentials? How can I impersonate? And you've seen so many talks already talking about that stuff, but I think we forget often about the insider threat, and it's not the person sitting next to you necessarily, it's their access. What can their access do? And then finally, here, I saw this in a TED Talk having nothing to do with cyber, but I thought it was so relevant to cyber, which is the absence of disease does not mean health. Just because you're not compromising on the front page doesn't mean you're healthy. Like, look at the Bloodhound example. 100% of people could get to domain admin. Maybe they weren't compromised. But were they healthy? Absolutely not. So, what's going on? Well, there's a huge disconnect between IT and security. Now, some companies it's a little bit better, but some companies it's terrible, where IT is really around enablement, provisioning, and maybe you have slightly different terms. Maybe it's subgroups, maybe they're all under the same umbrella, where security is then meant to kind of clean up afterwards or monitor or be some sort of overlay, but they don't necessarily have a seat at the table around provisioning and accounts and that kind of thing. And I thought the video this morning, played that up a little bit. So, race to the cloud. In my talk, I'm a little bit more focused on cloud and a little less focused on the Microsoft stuff, since that's sort of been covered. There are a ton of benefits of cloud adoption. We aren't here for that. You guys feel free to tell me otherwise. I meet with even conservative financial institutions, been around 100 years, and they're like, we're 100% going to cloud. Everything's cloud first. You have to get special permission to buy anything that's not cloud native. So it's here, right? And again, very, very smart technical audience. You guys know this. But IT is going from 0 to 100 to the cloud and leaving security in the dust. And these are just random quotes, but I thought they're so relevant. We're blind to all these new SaaS accounts. We don't know what people are doing in AWS. And then things like hackers don't break in, they log in. Very relevant to an identity conference. And at the end, I give a few examples of some of the worst cases I've heard, and you guys can probably beat that since you all work in this space. But enterprise architectures are complex. You have all these different systems. You do still have some on-prem. You have some infrastructure as a service. You have some SaaS. And even with SaaS, you're still responsible. And again, I'm going to steal that talk or that video for next time that I think Darren played. Because that's the thing. Like, people think, oh yeah, it's cloud. It's someone else's problem. So going back to that, we used to control the devices our users used and the networks they were on. Then we started losing control of the networks they were on, so that's why endpoint has about 100 different vendors in it. And it became very important to be as close to the human activity as possible in your defense. But now we're losing control of that too. So we're losing control of the network, we're losing control of the back end, and let's be honest, each of you probably has your personal device checking your corporate accounts or Salesforce or whatever right now. So we have to manage access. We can't control assets anymore. So, again, probably this is stuff that is first, second nature, whatever to you guys. But maybe there's some things in here that you can use to sell your agenda to your coworkers, your peers, your higher ups, your subordinates. Azure and AWS have these nice graphs that show what you're responsible versus them. I like AWS is a little bit better, but basically, they're responsible for security of the cloud. You're responsible for security in the cloud. And that's the point that I think a lot of people miss is all this stuff, right? Like whether it's your data the bad guys want, whether it's your identity, whether you want to create some compute and use all the crypto mining type stuff, whatever it is, that's stuff that you're responsible for. Yeah, maybe you don't have to worry about patching an OS or some of that stuff, maybe network, but you're still responsible for a lot. And even SaaS, they handle everything except a whole bunch of stuff, right? Except for identity access management, client controls, and data accountability. So you have to understand who's using that. And for Office 365, you're responsible for what's emailed, who accesses it, and how they access it. So, getting to identity creep. We're going fast. We're going to have a lot of time for questions or discussion or whatever, which is great. We've already made it through 25 slides in like 9 minutes. Just looking at us, like Obsidian. So I think when I took these screenshots, we were about 30 people. I think we're about 40 now. Just looking at dormant accounts in our AWS. 238 days. Give you a hint, that's my CEO. I think I'm in here somewhere because I don't get to do much fun stuff anymore. But the whole point is, even at a 30, 40, or small company, there's a lot of risk that doesn't necessarily have to be there. And then all I did, this was early into our stage, I dumped our AWS security policies. 20,000 lines of JSON. How is anyone supposed to understand what the hell that means? And guess what? We had basically defaults. We've done a lot more crazy stuff now, but this was more when we were just kind of doing research early in our product development. 20,000 lines. So one thing we start to think about is how do you visualize the difference? And whether this is to inform yourselves, or maybe, since when you work in IT or security, you often have to sell your agenda, can you visualize the difference between provisioned and active? Because that's a lot easier. Like a board can understand this. Not just technical people. You can say, look, here's all this extra Slack accounts that no one's actively logging into, or ServiceNow or AWS or whatever. So can you start to use visualizations or other aspects of this to your advantage? A big term last talk was empirical. Can you use empirical data and say, hey, look, we have a bad problem here. And guess what? And again, you guys all know this. Very, 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 very awesome community here, which I'm actually kind of new to this community, so it's kind of cool to see how tight everyone is. But there's huge problems. I've never talked to anyone that didn't have identity creep, even at our size. We're like, wait, who has admin? It's tough to keep track. And then, can you make it about cost? We talked to a 500 or 600 person company, just looking at a few of their services. $35,000, almost $34,000 a month in waste, in spend. And their CISO cannot get budget. But that's a couple, 3, 4, whatever headcount. So sometimes you have to speak in dollars to get people to wake up, right? I think most of us think about risk and compromise and mitigation of that. But can you speak maybe in terms that executives or the CIO or someone like that speaks in? Now, I'm focused a little bit on some of these SaaS and cloud providers. It's not really any different with Active Directory, IaaS, or SaaS. Sure, maybe Active Directory you're not paying per user, but we just saw how 100% of that environment was able to become domain admin through some traversal of the graph. And IaaS, really, really bad, really easy to sign up for AWS or add accounts or things like that. And same with SaaS. So let's talk a little bit about countering creep. So if you're old enough to remember, there was this thing called AAA. Anyone remember that? A little bit. So authentication, authorization, and accounting. Now, authentication and identity as a whole, but authentication has gotten a lot of focus, a lot of press, a lot of investment. And that's cool, that's great. MFA, biometrics, some of the kind of conditional access, I think would fall under that. But what about authorization? Do people have the right privileges? And then what are they doing with them? Because when I think about identity creep, it's not just about who has an account, but do they have the right privileges or permissions? And I think the other thing that tends to be a challenge is it's a cycle. It's not just you show up, you get access, and you're good for a long time. No, people get access, whether it's an account or entitlements, and then they use them, and then at some point, can you deprovision? So we'll talk about that a little bit more. So there are tools to help you. So can you visualize, as we talked about before, or can you get some telemetry around who's doing what? And I think these are G Suite and Slack. But these products and these services are getting better and better at providing you this information. So can you go in and see who's shared stuff outside domains, or who's actually logging in as a guest? We all probably have guests on our Slack, and Slack's gotten a little bit better at making them have an expiration date. But can you see who's doing what? The other thing, if you're not familiar with the latest Slack thing, they allowed you to create like a pipe between two different Slack orgs. So you can literally have your company Slack and another company Slack share a channel, which is awesome, but it's scary as hell too. Someone drops a file into that, and now everyone at the other company has access, right? So really cool advancement by Slack, but there's a lot of stuff that, just the blast radius of a mistake could be bigger now. But the whole point is there's this information available, and yet, you talk to people and they're like, yeah, I think there's some interesting logs, but I don't know, I never looked at them. It's like, well, why not? This is your system of record for chat, or your system of record for email, or maybe Google's your identity provider now. So can you understand who's using that and doing that. So one thing we have to stop doing is, we just sort of made this term up, but provision and forget. So who joins a company and you get given probably way too much access? Probably everyone, right? So day one, you already have all sorts of accounts when really you just need a subset of that. And then as you go, maybe you add on, but really, can it be more as you need, right? Like sort of a need to know, a need to have. I was talking to my buddy the other night at dinner, who's a trader at JP Morgan. He says, yeah, every time they ask me if I need these accounts, I say yes, because he's afraid to lose them, right? But we need to figure out, like, what do people actually need? And so one thing that people need to start doing, and some ideas, I'm hoping you take some ideas away from here, is progressive pruning. Again, I'm just like making up terms because I haven't seen terms around this stuff. But can you start chipping away and people can still do their job? And we'll come back to that. But there's definite risk. And again, as we talked about cost, can you keep chipping away and people still are as productive? Because the whole goal is to keep productivity, right? And everyone's always afraid to take anything away because it's going to impact productivity. Now, this works much better if you have a good provisioning process. So part of, stepping back for a second, part of Carbon Black, we merged with Bit9, which is an application whitelisting company. Application whitelisting, right, like only allowing certain apps to run, only works when you have a good exception handling process. Meaning, when someone needs a new app to run, there's an efficient process to authorize that app to run. It's kind of the same here. People are much more willing to give up access if there's a good process to get it back. And that's the problem. There isn't usually a good process to get it back. So typically you have to get sign-offs and work tickets and help desks involved, and maybe you have to, get some VP to sign off even. It takes a long time. And that's why my friend said, there's no way I'm giving these up because I might need it in 6 months and it might take forever to get it back. So can we make it much easier where you say, hey, I need access. And it's like, okay, here it is. Maybe it's logged, maybe the manager's alerted, but it isn't blocked. That's the key. And can it maybe be compared to the team, to the peers? Hey, why are you asking for something that no one else in your division has? Okay, maybe that gets blocked. But if most people have that, or a lot of people that sort of look like you have that, let's make it automated. The other problem? Guests, contractors, service accounts. We actually just heard that in the last talk as well. People get added, and then no one knows why this contractor has access, or the person that sponsored them leaves the org, and then there's really no oversight. I've talked to large energy companies where they have no idea what their partners are doing, and guess what? Their partners are their competitors because they partner up to do some major oil drilling and stuff like that. So they're competitive in certain aspects of the business and then partners in others. They have no idea. Are they accessing all this sensitive information? Who's even a contractor on my network? They don't know. So we need to start thinking about sponsorship around contractors, guests, etc. And then finally, can we start benchmarking? As I just mentioned, can you see who else on the team or who else that reports up to this person has this access? And then some teams are doing this, where they actually have bots, whether it's a Slack bot or other things, where you request access and you get it, and it gets logged, and maybe your manager gets notified or maybe not. But the whole point is it reduces friction. It takes minutes. And then you can take it away much more easily because the person can go get it back. I heard a story from one of the major financials the other day that they don't allow USB keys. However, marketing would need USB key to go to a conference. When they gave that person in marketing the ability to enable a USB key, it would last for a year, even if they needed it for 5 minutes. Talk about creep. So the whole point is, can we make this much more automated, much more efficient? We're going fast. I'm almost done. It's only been 20 minutes. But we can have hopefully some discussion. If not, you guys get longer for lunch. So I'm going to throw a lot of takeaways at you, mostly because I like takeaways when I go to talks. So in all of my travels, the best security teams think about the problems as engineering problems, not as analysis problems. And what I mean by that is they think about how can I construct solutions, how can I piece different tools, different data sets together, versus I'm just going to buy tools and look at reports or just look at data. So hopefully, if you're a full-time practitioner working for an end-user organization, you get some time to think about how do I code against this API, how do I tie these things together, et cetera. The other thing is everyone has different perspectives, different incentives. The people on the right are not qualified to make that thing, and the people on the left are not qualified to go in it. They're all working on the same project, though. So when you're thinking about how do I reduce creep, or how do I implement this new service, how do I get buy-in to use AWS, or how do I move to Slack, or even just move to Azure AD from on-prem AD, you got to think about the different incentives and learn how to sell. Oops. The other thing is we've got to reduce entropy. Now, if you work at any sizable organization, as we've sort of been talking about, it looks like that, guaranteed. Looks like the one on the left. It's really hard to look like the one on the right. But if you can get the one on the right, or you can at least make progress on that, when your adversary or your insider threat or someone starts going perpendicular, or there's a truck on the racetrack, it's much easier for a system to detect that, or a human to detect that. So left is sort of nature's default, right? Defaults to chaos and entropy. We got to work hard. And things like accounts and access and privilege tend to go to the left very, very quickly. Now, things like Okta or single sign-on, some of the Microsoft stuff, help with when an employee leaves. You can usually cut off most of their access. But what about while they're still there? Can we get more of that reduction of risk, make their identity more elastic? That's been really hard. So I truly believe the cloud is a huge opportunity to unify IT and security. IT provides appropriate tech, or in this case you could say appropriate access. Security provides appropriate risk. It's actually helping in some ways, hurting in others. We can talk about that. So I figured since I'm up here on a soapbox, give you some InfoSec tips. Again, just as my journeys and my person much more in the sort of security ops and security realm, approach it as an engineering problem. What can you build? What can you tie together? You know, a lot of these companies, like Silicon Valley companies that I think have really, really strong security programs, they basically just have software engineers. And some of them don't even have a SOC anymore, because it's all about tying information together. And some of the stuff they need is that user involvement. What's the first thing that you do when you think an account's compromised? You call the person. Can we make that a little bit more efficient? Right? It's kind of like a credit card style alert. We have to fix provision and forget and deploy and decay. So quit creating a whole bunch of sort of tech debt or security risk debt and then letting it be. We have to fix that. We actually have to treat our users as smart. I like to call it your sort of National Guard. Reduce entropy, reduce risk. So work together with IT if you're not in IT. And then you have to make it fun for security. Now, coming back to creep, I think we're hearing some of these themes, but maybe I'm putting it a little bit differently. So we got to consolidate entry points. How you log in, how you access stuff, you got to get to single sign-on or some sort of consolidated sort of choke points to get to all these different applications, services, whatever. You have to then start doing much more frequent auditing and review of entitlements, of privilege. And I'm happy to see that there's more and more movement to just-in-time provisioning, where you're kind of getting access for that hour, for that 2 hours, right? You see some vendors doing it. You see some companies building their own access. We've heard about it a little bit, but you don't need admin all the time to check your email. But yet, if you can get admin for your account just for a little bit, it's still more easily tied to you versus using some shared admin account or some other thing, right? And then finally, I think this is the big missing piece. What are people doing? What's the telemetry around activity? Can you use that to inform authorization? Like, hey, you have not used your write privileges to GitHub for 6 months. You've used read, you've not used write. Can we take write access away? These are the things that, when I say it like that, sounds so stupid and easy and simple, but we all know it's way harder than that in the real world. But can you start looking to see what people are doing to inform what their privilege and their authorization should be? So a few more things. So seen a lot of use it or lose it, especially at the account level. It's a little bit harder right now for most people at the entitlement or the privilege level. But hey, if you haven't logged in a long time, like, we're shutting it off. That's pretty simple. Still, most people don't do that, but that's pretty simple. Can we decrease defaults? Like, some of these teams, what they're trying to do, and what we hope they do, is you basically show up and you get no access at your job. And then you ask for the privileges you need, and if you have a much more efficient and automated provisioning system, then it starts adding those, logging them, auditing what you've asked, making sure your peers have that. But can we decrease defaults so you don't start from behind, start with more risk? Entitlement management, again, that's really hard just in time. And ownership, like, who's responsible for this? Who's responsible for identity creep? The people that provision aren't typically responsible for the added risk. They're responsible for getting that ticket done or giving that user access. But what about if they give too much access? Who's responsible for sort of chipping away at that extra risk, extra cost? And if we make it easy to do the right thing, it just makes our lives easier. So what I mean by that is, a lot of times it's too hard for a team to get what they need, so they go around, right? I think I'll come back to it, but I was talking to a major airline, and they're like, yeah, we found out about 16 different Slack organizations in our company. We don't even allow Slack. But if they had made it easier to do the right thing, they would have known about it, maybe monitored it, whatever, maybe tied it into single sign-on. But it's hard. And same with AWS. Anyone that has any sort of spending account in their little team or division or whatever, up to a few $1,000 or whatever, they can sign up for stuff really easy. But if you make it easier to go through the proper channel and try to reduce friction, you're not going to get this creep that you get right now. So a few more aspects here. So we have to accept that identity creep exists and credential abuse is real. I don't know that anyone has denied that identity creep is real. I've never met someone that said, oh yeah, no, we're perfect elasticity around our needs. And credential abuse, you know, I liked the previous talk where they talked about how attackers think in graphs. I have a slightly different statement, which is defenders defend infrastructure, attackers attack humans. So there's like a huge disconnect. Like, you're looking at IPs and, you know, OSs and stuff over here. Here you're saying, hey, I'm going to target Ben or Joe or Bob or whatever, and then figure out who to get to after that. So credential abuse is huge, and you know, back when I was doing different things on the less defensive side, we'll say, credentials were awesome. There's plenty of APIs. Everyone's becoming more and more API friendly. So work with them, pull them in. Even if you just pull some data from Office 365 or Active Directory or any of these systems and throw it into Splunk or QRadar or whatever you're using, it's actually not that difficult to at least get some raw information. Not always the best logs, but at least it's better than nothing. Your processes, make provisioning easier. You get a prune. Just like your landscaping at your house or whatever, you get a prune. And you get to prune a little bit more progressive, get more and more chipping away. And then if you can get to as close to no access as possible, you're going to be in a better place. But again, this requires easier provisioning. And then, can you involve the team? You have this whole army of people who know what they're doing, who know who they sponsored as a guest, whatever. Make them have that ownership. Make them say, yep, I'm responsible for this person's access, and whether it's in comments or stored somewhere else in a table or something, you at least know who to go to. Because again, I keep going back to previous talks, how often do people say, I have no idea where their service account came from? Probably daily, right? So some of the things I've heard that are pretty bad, 70,000 employees, 350,000 Active Directory groups. Well, I told you guys might have win. What's the worst you've heard?
Just say that there was a ratio of 1 to 50.
1 to 50. All right, so 10x this. Cool. Now I can use that in my next slide. 400 AWS accounts, no governance. You beat that one. And then, as I talked about, 16 different Slack orgs, and Slack's not involved or allowed. It's becoming a huge problem. Just to give you one more thing to take away, I'm a huge book nerd, and I spend a lot of my time around people and teams and hiring. So 3 of my favorite books. Essentialism. How do you spend time on the vital few versus the trivial many, I think is his quote. Extreme Ownership is incredible, and everyone I've talked to loved that book. And then Team of Teams is really cool. How do you get more sort of horizontal information flow? Totally random, I know, but I love book recommendations. So if people have book recommendations, please. Like all my free time, which is not much, but is spent reading things like this. So that's it. We're only halfway through our time. Thank you.